busy day in classrooms and traversing the campus, because I hope that your blood is flowing, because you're about to be empowered, you're about to be informed, you're about to be inspired, you're about to shift even your paradigms, because among us today is someone who has for 19 years, 7 months, 6 weeks, 3 days, and now as of today, 6.5 hours, has been leading a charge of stopping racism in this country. He has been featured on CNN News, on 2020. He has authored several books which affirmative action professionals, academicians, and civil rights leaders around the country have all used as a tool for getting the message across and changing our minds and changing our thinking about race and race relations. Without further ado, I want to, since you made me tired, I want us to stand up one more time and to receive Tim Wise, my brother.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the late afternoon enthusiasm. I know it's difficult sometimes to conjure up. We had an earlier session. It was early. You know, folks were sort of fresh on the day, so I expected it from them, but I'm very appreciative to get that from you as well. And thank you for coming out. As I said earlier today, and I've had the opportunity to speak to a couple other class groups this morning, speak with some administrative staff and faculty this afternoon. I'm always very heartened when I come to speak to a campus and there are people who actually show up, not just because any speaker wants people to show up, but because when it comes to this issue, when it comes to this topic of race and racism in America, there are so many other voices in the country that would have you believe that you really don't need to come to events like this, that we in fact don't really need to have events like this anymore, that to talk about race and racism is no longer necessary, that it's very 2007, so to speak, right? By which I mean there are people who apparently believe that because the election of a man of color as president took place not once but now twice, that this subject of race and racism is a dead issue. It's our parents' issue, it's our grandparents' issue. It's an issue for a different generation. So, the fact that in spite of all of that noise that we hear, that you would still come out, even if it's in part for some academic credit because your professors told you to come, certainly says something. It says something about your professors' willingness and desire, at the very least, to make sure that you do engage on these issues, even when, and perhaps especially because, having certain outward manifestations of social change, like the election of a president of color, can very easily trick us into believing that these issues are really no longer with us.
Yes.
When it comes to that particular issue, I think we know that to be true. Right? Because if you were to think about this for a second, I'm sure at some point you've heard it said, or something like it, that the election of Barack Obama means that these issues are no longer really pertinent, no longer really necessary, and yet, if you were to think about that and apply that logic to other areas of the world and other dynamics other than race, it probably wouldn't hold up for you, right? So if I were to suggest to you that women and girls in Pakistan, or Israel, or India, or the Philippines, or Great Britain, or Ireland, all of which countries have had female heads of state, by the way, and I'm sure there are several others that I didn't name who have had female heads of state. If I were to suggest to you that women and girls in those places no longer face sexism, that the patriarchal oppression of women no longer exists, and this I know simply because Benazir Bhutto was elected head of state in Pakistan in 1988 and again in 1991. Now, since then she's been assassinated, so that lets you know how much some people love her. But the reality is, in all of those places I just mentioned, there have been women who have run the government, and yet my guess is that no one in this room would conclude from that fact that institutional mistreatment of girls and women had ceased in those places. I doubt very seriously that any of the women in this room, for instance, would think to themselves, you know what I think I'm going to do at the end of this talk? Forget this whole finishing up college thing. I'm just going to pack my bags and move to Karachi, where I'll have equal opportunity. You wouldn't do that. My 10-year-old daughter would know enough to know that just because individual women in places like Pakistan, Israel, India, Great Britain, the Philippines, and Ireland have attained great power, that doesn't change the larger social dynamic that women face. And so I think we understand, I hope we understand, that individual and systemic change are very different. By the same token, there are people who might not go so far as to deny the problem, Some people will. There are other people who may not deny it, but you've heard them say things like this: well, it's not that racism is dead, it's not that it's not a problem, it's just we shouldn't talk about it. The more you talk about it, the more you keep it alive. Those of us who do this work professionally, whether it's as civil rights attorneys or civil rights activists or writers who write about race or artists who do art related to race, are often accused of that, right? That somehow we're the ones who keep racism alive by talking about it. If you just wouldn't talk about it, it would die. It's people like you, meaning people like me, and those who do their work in the field of affirmative action and civil rights compliance, that are accused of somehow being responsible for the maintenance of the problem. And yet, once again, if you really think that through and apply that argument to any other social problem, you would instantly see how ridiculous it was. Like if I were here to give a talk on world hunger today, right? And I'm standing up here and I were to tell you, because it's true, that there are billions of children on the planet who are starving right now for lack of adequate nutrition, I doubt very seriously any of you would jump out of your chairs and go, shh, damn fool, don't talk about that, man. You talk about children starving and they're gonna die. That's how that works, You speak of death and people drop dead. On the other hand, if you just wouldn't talk about starvation, food would miraculously appear on your plates and they would suffer no more. Like, you would know that was nonsense. If I were here to give a talk about crime, crime's a serious problem. I know that. I've been the victim of crime. I've been held up at gunpoint, had my apartment broken into, my car broken into over the course of my life. But who among you in response to that would tell me to be quiet? Because God forbid, if we talk about crime, somebody's going to get carjacked, right? But if we just don't talk about it, nobody's going to be a victim. We can empty all the prisons, empty all the jails, fire all the cops. My God, what a brilliant idea for fighting crime. Why didn't somebody think of it? Because it's stupid as hell. That's why it's not a solution to the problem. You can't solve a social problem that you're not willing to address or to talk about or to confront. It's like blaming the speedometer for the speeding ticket you just got, to blame the conversation about race for the problem of racism. The speedometer didn't cause you to go 80 and a 65, and it just told you what you did, that's all. It's just a method of communicating social reality. And that's what this is, talking about the problem so that we can then collectively figure out what needs to be done about it. But there's one more way in which we avoid the conversation. So the first is just outright denial. The second is not denial, but saying that we need to be quiet so as not to make the problem worse. The third, and this is something that white folks in particular do, and I've been white a really long time, so I've had an opportunity to see this for several decades. White folks are very quick to try to get out of the problem of racism by talking about, oh, I've got black friends. Every black person in America has heard this from a white person whom they don't even know, let alone consider their friend, right? White folks will often say how many black friends they have, or I dated an Asian woman once, or I've got a dream catcher in my rear view mirror, so now I think I'm Native American, and my great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess, and she was not a Cherokee princess. And most of the time when white folks say we have black and brown friends, just be honest, we're lying. Like most of the time, we're just lying. And I can say this because there was a survey taken just a few years back that actually found that 75% of white Americans, 3 out of 4, said they had many black friends. Now, do you have any idea what that means? When you say many of something, like if you wanted to say you had one black friend, which I'm not even sure I would believe that, but if you wanted to tell me you had one, you would say a, not many. If you wanted to tell me you had 2, you would say what? A couple. If you wanted to tell me you had 3, you would say what? A few. So when you say many, you just committed to having 4 or more black friends each. Now, I'm not good with math, but I have a calculator and it's funny. It does the work for me. So I looked up the census data to find out what is 75% of white America. Because that's how many people say they got 4 or more black friends each. And I crunched the numbers, and you know what that was? It was 142 million white people who say they have 4 or more black friends each. Now, there are only 35 million black people to go around. And half of them say they don't have any white friends. So actually, white folks don't even have 35 million black people to hang out with. They only have 17.5 million. 17.5 million black folks to go around for 142 million white people. I'm thinking that either white folks are exaggerating how many black friends we have, or black folks are incredibly busy running from white person house to white person house to white person house, hanging out with us, being our friends, which is really mighty nice of y'all, but probably unlikely, right? So sometimes we say that. We say how close we are to people as a way to shut down the conversation, as a way to duck our own responsibility. Because the truth is, even if what we were saying were true, even if we have close connections to people across racial lines, and I realize some of us do, And some of us always have. But even if we have those real connections, that doesn't get us out of the problem of racism. Because if that were true, like men could say, if they're heterosexual, oh, I date women, I can't be sexist, I'm married to one. Like, how is that possible? The only sexist men are gay. Really? That doesn't make any sense, right? That would be what you could say, though, just because you have a close connection to women if you're a straight man. But that's not a defense against the problem of sexism, and more importantly, it wouldn't change the larger structure, would it? See, this is how I know that. Because I was one of those white folks who actually could have answered that question yes and not been lying. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1970s. Just about all my friends in the early grades were black. I went to a preschool that was a historically black college, early childhood ed program at Tennessee State. I was one of 3 white kids in a class of about 25 children. Most of the teachers, the caretakers, the administrators of that program were black women. So for the earliest part of my academic career, I was embedded in a black cultural context, in a black educational context. All of my peers were African American kids, but yet here's the thing. Did that really, at the end of the day, protect any of those friends from mistreatment in the classroom? Absolutely not. The fact that I cared about them and they cared about me, the fact that we were close, the fact that we were in fact friends, the fact that we played on the same ball teams and we hung out in the cafeteria and we played on the playground as little kids, did that actually change the dynamic that those individuals were dealing with in terms of the way teachers treated them? No, it didn't protect them. It didn't change the fact that almost all of them were being tracked into the lower level classes and the white students were being tracked into the higher level classes, not because we were smarter, not because we'd been tested. We were 6. There is no test at the age of 6 that you can give a child that will determine their academic potential 10 years later, but I'll be damned if we didn't stay in those tracks. All throughout grade school, all throughout middle school, all throughout high school, and on throughout our lives. But even though I was close to those young people, even though those were my friends, I didn't see that. I knew we were being separated, and I didn't like that just because those were my friends over there, and I was over here with these white people, and I didn't know them. Right? That was a little weird for me. But I didn't put it together. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't have a language for what was happening, and I certainly didn't intervene to stop it. So in other words, yeah, I had the best of intentions. I was right there with them every day. That's who I hung out with. But at the end of the day, they were still experiencing those schools and that educational system very differently. Now, I'd like to tell you that that was just a 1970s United States, Nashville, Tennessee story, but it's not. Because what the data tells us even today is that all of that stuff that was happening to my black friends when I was in those schools is still happening to students of color all around this country. Where African American and Latino students in particular, and in some parts of the country, Southeast Asian students as well, but especially black and Latino students, are about 2 to 3 times more likely than white students to be placed in those lower level classes. White students 2 to 3 times more likely to be placed in the advanced level classes. White students twice as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. Black and Latino students twice as likely to be taught by the least experienced teachers. And the schools that are attended mostly by students of color are 10 to 12 times more likely to be places of concentrated poverty. So in every single way, the system of educational inequity remains operative, in spite of the fact that sometimes we actually do have friendships and connections across racial lines. The point I'm trying to make is that even when we do discuss race, we need to be clear that sometimes we're not looking at the deeper structural, systemic, institutional reality. We're only looking at the surface level. We're assuming that racism is about bad people who do bad things to other people. Well, it is about that, but it's also about the fact that even when folks are good and caring and compassionate and mean well, they can find themselves in systems that perpetuate inequality, and sometimes that flies under the radar. You don't even notice that it's happening. To give you some examples of what I mean. So for instance, what's the bigger problem? Let's say, for example, and I'm sure it's true, that there are individual teachers in this country, in K through 12 schools, and in colleges for that matter, who are out and out racist. I don't have any doubt that that's true, but is that the biggest problem, or is this the biggest problem? That those systemic inequities that I just mentioned about whether it's funding or teacher qualifications or concentrated poverty or who's in honors and who's not, who is suspended or expelled and who's not, because we know the data says that black students in particular are 2 to 3 times more likely than white students to be suspended or expelled from school, even though all racial groups break the rules at the same rate. Contrary to stereotype, white folks break the rules just as often as black students and Latino students, but are less likely to be harshly disciplined. Is that the bigger problem, or is some random racist teacher the bigger problem? See, it seems to me the systemic inequalities, which may or may not be the result of bigots, may or may not be the result of overt racism. It might be just that there's an assumption that people make, that guidance counselors and principals and teachers make, about who's capable and who's not. And it may not be rooted in hatred, it may not be rooted in bigotry, it may be rooted in a sincerely held fiction, right? A sincerely held belief that certain folks just aren't as good as other folks, or that certain folks are simply more disruptive and more problematic than other folks. But whether it is sincerely held or the result of bigotry, even sincerely held bigotry, isn't the biggest issue. Same thing is true for jobs and income and unemployment. If you look at the data there, for instance, consider this. This is data from the Labor Department recently. African American students with a college degree, almost twice as likely as white students with a college degree to be unemployed. So in spite of having similar educational credentials, almost twice as likely to be out of work, even when those black students have done everything right, stayed in school, did exactly what was asked of them. Latino students with a degree, about 50% more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with a degree, about a third more likely than whites with a degree to be out of work. So even when you have folks who have similar educational backgrounds, they do not have similar outcomes for their hard work and their effort. Likewise, Labor Department data finds, and this is truly shocking information, right, between the ages of 25 and 29, if you just look at white men between 25 and 29, so that's like the beginning of their careers, that's early on in their careers. They make more money on average than black men who are between 50 and 54, who have 25 additional years of experience. Think about that. I have 25 more years of experience than you, and you still make more than me. Now that can't be about qualifications, that can't be about seniority, that can't be about experience. By definition, you have more experience, in this case black males, and there's similar data that's relative to black females versus white females, I should point out, right? Suggesting that even when folks of color have more experience and the same education, they are less likely to have a job, and they are more likely, much more likely to earn less. So what's that about? I guess there are two possibilities that you could imagine. One is that it's the result of overtly racist employers. Well, I'm sure there are some of those. There's no doubt about that. We have plenty of studies and examples that come in the news every couple of years to demonstrate that that's true. But my guess is that actually what explains that unemployment disparity or that income and earning disparity is actually worse than just overt bigoted employers. It's actually more pernicious, more evil, more systemic than that. So for instance, 6 months ago, there's an article in the New York Times, front section, that says, referring to a study that had just been done, the study had found that about half of the new jobs in the economy were being filled by way of recommendations made by people who already worked for the company in question. In other words, if you want to get a job, you got to know Bill over in the accounting department, or you got to know Mary over in human resources, right? Because 50% of the jobs are basically off limits if you don't know somebody who already works there. Now you may think to yourself, well, fine, that's not really great, but what does that have to do with race? Well, I guess in theory, nothing. In theory, it's not about race, but in practice, who do you think is more likely to be in the pipeline already working for that company or that entity or that firm, and therefore have a chance to make the recommendations to people who they know? Well, the data says that the overwhelming majority of people who benefit from that old boys network are white, and they're male, and they're upper middle class, and they went to the quote-unquote right schools, which is to say usually elite private universities, right? So what does that mean? It means that if you're a person of color, if you're a woman of any color, if you're working class, regardless of race, you could be working class or lower income and white, and you pretty much don't even have a shot at 50% of the jobs because you're not in the right network. You might be the most qualified person for the next job, but they're not even going to know you exist, and you're not going to know that that job exists. So if you don't know the job exists, you can't apply for it. If you can't apply for it, you can't get it. And if you can't apply for it, you can't even really be rejected for it, like in a formal way, right? So you can't even claim to have been the victim of overt discrimination because they didn't discriminate against you. They just didn't even know you existed, right? It's systemic exclusion. It's like having a race and not even telling people there is a race. And then when they don't get in the race, let alone win the race, we blame them for not winning the race they didn't even know existed. right? This is systemic inequality, and yet when was the last time that any politician trying to get your vote or any media mouthpiece talking about the economic crisis actually talked about that aspect of the economic crisis? We talk about unemployment in the abstract and how bad it is, and that's true for millions of people, including millions of white folks right now. But we rarely talk about the specific racial inequalities in the job market or in terms of schools or in terms of income. Right? So we've got to be prepared to look more deeply and look at the systems that perpetuate these inequalities, even when intent is lacking. In other words, even when there are no awful, horrible, evil, racist bigots in the room doing these things, if we're hiring based on who you know, not what you know, the exclusion will be persisting. Right? Regardless of whether or not there are individual racist cops in New York City, and of course I know there are, but let's be honest about something. Do we really think that stop and frisk, which has been going on now since the late 1990s, and the courts have technically said it can't continue, but you know it's not going to stop just because the courts have said that it has to stop. Since the late 1990s, the NYPD has been involved in stop and frisk. Now, 88% of the people who have been stopped have been Black and Latino. 90% of them have done nothing wrong. They haven't been arrested, they haven't been cited for anything, they haven't gotten a ticket for jaywalking. They haven't done anything. 90% of the people that get stopped and frisked haven't done anything, but they keep stopping them and they keep frisking them. Only 5% have drugs on them, so 95% don't. Only 0.2% have a weapon. So 99.8% of the stops don't result in the confiscation of a weapon, but they keep justifying this policy, don't they? And how do they justify it? Mayor Bloomberg justified, well, for a minute more, Mayor Bloomberg, not for long, justifies it, and Chief Kelly and others in New York City will justify it by saying, well, we gotta get guns off the street. What is this? If you're only finding weapons 0.2% of the time, what the hell kind of crime control strategy is that? I could do better by just like walking down the streets of Manhattan and playing tag, just like, yeah, you and you and you. I could take like a paintball gun and just start shooting you, and if I hit you, you have a weapon, and I'd probably do better than 0.2%. Right? I could roll a ball down the street in Brooklyn, and whoever it touches, you just got to be honest. You have a gun, and I bet I could get like at least 1%. Right? All they can get is 0.2%. This isn't crime control; it's people control. But is it because the cops and the mayor and the chief are overtly racist and bigoted? I don't know. I haven't been able to test them for that. But what I do know is, even if not one of them was an inherently bigoted person, if they have certain assumptions about who's dangerous, not based on hatred, not based on bigotry, but because they believe that that's true. They actually believe these are the folks with the drugs and these are the folks with the guns, even though the data says that white folks are just as likely to use drugs as Black folks and Latinos, just as likely to sell drugs as Black folks and Latinos. That's not the common perception, but it's the statistical reality. If I'm a cop and I happen to believe that, I might not be hateful, but I'm still going to perpetuate inequality, you see. So we have to be prepared to have that conversation, particularly around drugs. You know, I joked about this in the last session, but I think it's important and it's relevant. I didn't really need a bunch of government studies or data for the court case regarding stop and frisk to know that the war on drugs wasn't about drugs. I could have told you this from personal experience. And I can tell you this now because the statute of limitations has expired, so I can be honest, you understand. When I lived in New Orleans, I worked in public housing projects for about 15 months as a community organizer. At a time when public housing in New Orleans was about almost all Black, all poor. It was considered the quote-unquote worst public housing in the United States, the most dangerous, the most crime-ridden, the most drug-infested. And I'm telling you, I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in all of public housing combined for 15 months than I saw on a typical weekend on the 8th floor of my dorm at Tulane University, which was my floor, right? I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing projects than I saw on a typical Saturday in room 804, which I think was my room, but I can't be sure because drugs were involved. But as a white person, right, I had the luxury of not really worrying that the Tulane police or the New Orleans police were going to break down my door and confiscate the weed that they knew full well that people were smoking behind that door, because white folks had that luxury, still have that luxury of knowing that they're not going to be stopped and not going to be searched and not going to be frisked. Right? And it doesn't have to require bigotry. I've done trainings with police officers while I'll ask them questions about what they think when they see a young Black male driving a nice car in the community. And every single time I do that, every time I ask police, even the Black officers, not just the white officers, even the Black officers will answer the question by saying that they presume that that person is a drug dealer. Now, they may not hate Black people, but they make that assumption about that young Black male in a nice car. Then I ask them, well, what if you see a young white male in the same kind of car, same age, same neighborhood, same kind of vehicle. What do you assume? Never has one of them ever said they assumed drug deal. Every time they say, well, you know, spoiled little rich kid, daddy buddy probably bought him a car. Right? Which is to say that they're making an assumption, yes, and they might not like the white kid who they assume is a spoiled little rich kid, but they're not stopping him, are they? And they're not going to frisk him. They're not going to pull him over and throw him over the hood of his car and search him like a common criminal, because they're not making those assumptions. So we need to be clear about some of the ways that even decent people, even good-hearted, intended, compassionate, and caring people can still internalize various biases. And we know this is true. There's a whole lot of research on this now. This isn't just me saying this. This is 15, 20 years of research in social psychology, which finds that the vast majority of us have internalized certain prejudices and biases and beliefs about certain stereotypes being true about those who are racially different, religiously different, disabled, sexually different sexual identity or sexual orientation, right? That we do this. We all do it. We do it because we've been subjected to nonstop imagery in media, nonstop lessons directly or indirectly from parents and peers, and again, especially I would say from the media, right? So it's just like advertising, right? Why do you think corporations spend billions of dollars to sell you products, right? Why do they spend billions to take out these commercials to make you think that you've got to have this kind of toilet paper and this kind of tennis shoe and this kind of, smartphone and this kind of toothpaste or whatever it is, right? Why do they do that? They do it because they know that if you see enough advertisements for Charmin toilet paper, that by God, you're going to go buy Charmin toilet paper. You're all of a sudden, after like a dozen ads, you're going to be like, oh my God, I've got to have Charmin. I can't use Angel Soft anymore. It's horrible. It is not soft enough, and it is not angelic. I must get a different kind of toilet paper. They know that enough people will do that. Taco Bell knows if they run that ad at 1 in the morning, you don't want a damn burrito at 1 in the morning, but they know that if they show you that ad, you're like, oh my God, that looks really good. I should probably get one of those. And you may not do it the first time, you may not do it the second time, but after you've seen that ad, there is market research which actually says that a significant number of people, once they've seen like a dozen of those ads, will actually get in their car and go to Taco Bell to get a bean burrito that they did not even want, right? Just because they all of a sudden have this impulse, right? So if that can happen with consumer products, if it can happen with food, if it can happen with tennis shoes and toilet paper and toothpaste, how much easier do you think it would be to have us fall into the traps of racial stereotypes or religious stereotypes or gendered stereotypes or economic stereotypes? Because we've seen that commercial, so to speak, a lot more than 12 times, haven't we? We've been exposed to those things since we were little kids. And so we all have begun to internalize this stuff. The research says that about 75% of white Americans have internalized anti-black racial bias at a subconscious level, not at a conscious level, not at an overt level, right, but at a subconscious level. One of the ways that they can test for subconscious bias is, there was a study done just a few years ago on this where they took white folks, put us in rooms, right, and then they had us monitored with a brain scan imaging machine, right, so they hook us up to a brain scan imaging machine. And they start flashing images on a computer screen, and they're flashing them really quickly, so quickly that your conscious mind can't even really follow what happened. Like you don't even know that you saw an image. It's that quick, but your subconscious mind can register, right? Your subconscious brain is able to see an image. Your conscious brain cannot. It's like 80 milliseconds or something is how quick they flash the images. So they flash a bunch of images. Some of them are pretty neutral, like a picture of a flower, a picture of a puppy dog, a popsicle, whatever, right? And for the most part, the brain scan doesn't really do anything. No real activity, no, excitement, no particular part of the brain lights up. And then they show an image, 80 milliseconds, again, too fast for your conscious brain to process, of a black male face. Now what happens? They have the brain scan imaging on. All this time, the brain's not doing anything. There's not really any activity. Black male face pops onto the screen so quick, conscious mind can't even process it. All of a sudden, the back of the brain, right back here, starts to light up like a Christmas tree. Now, what's the part of the brain back here, and what is it responding to? This is the part of the brain that responds to fear, anxiety, stress. Right? So all of a sudden, you put a black male face on the screen, and white folks subconsciously, because they're not consciously reacting. It's not like they saw the face and were like, oh my God, black man, I gotta run. I gotta get the hell out of this room. Like they didn't even know that's what they saw, but their brain knew, and all of a sudden they're responding in an anxious or afraid manner. What's that about? It's about the fact that even decent people who are not consciously racist, consciously bigoted, consciously prejudiced are still internalizing. And here's what's really scary. Some of these studies on internal bias have found that 45% of black folks have internalized these biases against themselves. Almost half, right? Almost half of the African American community has bought into the same kind of stereotypes and prejudices that white folks are carrying around. And then data says the same thing is true about how we view Latino folk, particularly increasingly in this country as the Latino population grows. The same way that we view folks from the quote-unquote Middle East or people we perceive as Muslim, right? Especially in a post-9/11 environment. So whenever you're looking at those who are the quote-unquote other, what the data tells us is that we've all been conditioned and we've all internalized some of that. Now, some of us have internalized it more than others, and some of us are working hard to resist it, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Like, for instance, many years ago in 2003, I went to a conference in Iowa, and I was flying from Nashville that morning, and I got on the plane, right? And as I'm walking down the jet bridge to get on there, I do what I do like instinctively whenever I get on the plane. Now keep in mind, by 2003, I had been on the road speaking about these issues for 8 years, and I had been doing anti-racism work of some form or another for 13 years. So at this point, I know a lot about the issue. So I look into the cockpit, and I see for the first time in my life 2 black male pilots at the controls of the plane. Now the reason that's rare is because less than 3% of all the pilots in the commercial fleet in this country, at least that's at that time, and I don't think it's changed much, only about 3% of the pilots are black, male or female. So to have even 1 African-American pilot is really rare. To have 2 is just like unheard of, but there they were. And there I was, right, the professional anti-racist, no amateur. I'm a professional anti-racist. I know why racism is wrong. I know why racism is based on false thinking. But now I want to ask you, what do you think the first thought that popped into my mind, purely emotional reaction, was to seeing 2 black men about to fly me to Des Moines, right? Was it, we'll make it multiple choice, right? Because that's how we do tests in this country. Do you think my reaction was, oh, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. I'm so glad to have 2 black men flying me to Iowa. I cannot wait to get on my phone and tell all my friends that we have achieved equality in the air. Right? Don't let the sarcasm throw you. I might have responded that way, but I didn't. The response was actually B, and again, it was only for an instant, but it was long enough for my mind to process it, right? It was, oh my God, can these guys fly this plane? And then as I thought that, I was like, wait, what the hell? Where did that come from? And I caught it, and I was able to defeat the thought, and I realized how incredibly wrong and how incredibly racist that was. But the fact that I caught it really isn't the point of the story, right? The fact is that I had the thought, that it came into my mind in the first place. Good for me, I'm working on my stuff, so I was able to catch it and defeat the thought and wrestle it to the ground and not allow, I didn't run from the plane in terror, I kept it in check. But the point is, even somebody who had been trained to fight racism, even somebody who understood at a philosophical, moral, ethical, practical, theological level why racism was evil, can still be sucked in that moment, you see. And if that can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. What's really scary is I told that story for the first time in 2004 in Wisconsin. And it was interesting, we're in a room of 500 people, 250 were, about 350 were white, about 150 were folks of color. And I told that story, and then what was interesting was all of a sudden, some other white folks in the room started admitting to times that they had had racist thoughts, because it was now it's confession time, oh, Tim said it happened to him, so now I can be honest because he's not going to yell at me. Okay, cool. So then people started admitting their own stuff, and then after 5 white folks, all of a sudden people of color start putting their hands up, right? So I called on some folks, and they're like, you know what? Now that y'all are sharing, I'll be honest, I got on a plane once, had a black pilot, this is a black person speaking, had the same reaction. Or someone said, you know what? I walked into the bank to get a loan, and the loan officer was Latino, and I almost went to a different bank, and this was a Latino person talking. I told my friend, who's an educator in Yakima, Washington, Central Valley of Washington. He's a proud Chicano man, right? Very proud, activist, educator. And I was telling him this story. He said, man, look, I got to tell you, one day when my mom needed open heart surgery, I took her to Seattle, to the hospital there, to get it. And so here's this proud Chicano man taking his proud Chicano mother to the hospital for open heart surgery. He says, through the operating room doors comes the surgeon, right? And he says, hello, it's nice to meet you. My name is Dr. Martinez, right? And my friend's like, oh, no. I don't want Dr. Martinez. This is a proud Chicano man. He's like, no, I don't want Dr. Martinez. I need, some white dude with white hair, because that's the mark of excellence, right? And he caught himself But the fact that he caught himself doesn't change the fact that even he as a man of color had internalized this negativity. So we have to be honest, right, about the fact that not only are our systems flawed and profoundly unequal, but also that we have been damaged by a system that has taught us in so many ways to have these views. And if we don't get a hold of this, understand what happens. How are we going to be effective teachers? How are we going to be effective nurses? I know we got lots of folks in this school who are in the nursing program and others that are in different programs, but whatever it is you're going to do, let's just think about nursing for a second. Think about any kind of provision of healthcare. Think about social work. Think about therapists and counselors and teachers, whether it's K-12 or at the college level. If you have internalized certain biases about your students and you're not aware that you have them, what's going to keep you from operating on the basis of that bias? If you're not even aware of it, you can't challenge it in yourself. If you're going to be a nurse actually caring for patients, if you're going to be a therapist caring for clients or a social worker, whatever it is you do, if you have got these internalized biases about those who are different, whether it's racially, ethnically, in terms of language of origin, religion, sexuality, economic position, all of those things, gender, all of that, and you've internalized those biases, how are you going to do your job effectively? How are you going to do it fairly and equitably? The answer is you won't be able to. You can't teach people who you don't trust and who you don't think are capable of learning at some level. You can't provide health care to people who you don't view as competent to follow your treatment recommendations. This is what they're finding out in the field of healthcare, right? They're finding that one of the reasons that people of color have worse health outcomes than white folks is because too often times white physicians don't trust that their black and brown patients will be able to follow a treatment regimen, so they just don't recommend the same medicines, or they don't recommend the same surgeries that they might need to save the person's life because, oh, well, they're not going to follow my treatment regimen anyway, and, they just view them as somehow less capable, I guess, of taking care of themselves, and so they end up being less empathetic. They end up responding not to the needs of that patient, but to their own biases, and they do all of this subconsciously. Now, the good news is, even if something is subconscious, you can get a hold of it, but you have to force it out into the light, right? You have to actually make it something that's conscious. You have to aggressively work at it. You have to be, instead of colorblind, which is the term that everybody always uses, you have to actually be colorblind.